just when you thought it might be safe to go back onto YouTube, here's another podcast. Plants and the colonization of land. I bet you even thought we were done with evolution, didn't you? Nope. We are going to be talking all about, in this podcast, plant evolution. Oh dear, I can't have the red on the green. That's going to send me over the deep end. Okay? Plant evolution. So we're not going to be talking in detail about evolutionary theory, but we are going to be looking at how the evolutionary path is traced through the history of plant life on planet Earth. Okay? You really need to imagine yourself, how about 500 million years ago, and this is what planet Earth might have looked like if you had been walking around on it like these people are walking around in this place. There was no plant life. Plant life, remember that life started out as prokaryotic, bacterial-like life forms. Plants are eukaryotes. They're sophisticated eukaryotes. They didn't arrive until much, much later, about 500 million years ago. Relatively recent in considering all of life on planet Earth. Or all of the history of planet Earth, rather. Until that time, essentially all life had been aquatic. Life started in the water, and it wasn't really until plants came out and started colonizing the land that other organisms kind of followed them out. Until that point, the Earth was really pretty darn barren and would have looked like that. The seas would have been teeming with life, but land not so much, not until the plants paved the way. Okay? This is really critical, this idea present on this slide. The story of plant evolution, the story of plants on Earth, is a story of adapting from a life in the water to a life on land. That story had to happen for animals as well, and it's important that you understand how critical that line of thinking is. We need to think about this movement from water to land that plants and even animals had to make. Living in water, when your body's adapted for a life in the water, there are huge obstacles that have to be overcome if you are going to be able to survive out of water, in the air. Plants made that transition, and we need to understand what problems they had to overcome in order to get from that water life to land. So water to land, certainly you need to understand it in plants. Keep it in the back of your mind. Many of the same problems that plants had to overcome, animals had to overcome as well, as they made their transition from water to land. All right. Plants, of course, are enormously successful. You just have to look outside and look at the diversity and sheer numbers of plants. 290,000 living species among us today. And it is pretty concretely shown with genetic evidence, with fossil record, with all kinds of evidence, that green algae are the ancestors to the plants, the modern land plants. Green algae, if you might recall, belongs to kingdom Protista, which you might also recall is like the junk drawer of taxonomy. If scientists didn't know where to place an organism in the classification scheme, chuck it into Protista. Green algae was one of those. Now it is pretty sure that the green algae are in fact the ancestors of what we would call plants. The reason we don't call green algae plants is because they are not adapted to life on land. That's the key. They have no adaptations for that. But some people do advocate moving the green algae out of Protista and into the plant kingdom. I don't think that's happened yet, but who knows? Taxonomy is always in a state of flux. So here are some of those protists. You might have seen a Volvox. I know I show it to my freshmen. We have in the back of the classroom a long stringy protist called Spirogyra. It's a type of green algae. But this guy is the one I want you to notice, because that guy right there is the protist. It is also a green algae, but it is thought to be the closest living algal relative to the plants. It is thought to be an organism that shares a common ancestor with our modern plant group. It's called a charophyte. It's important for you to understand these guys did not give rise to plants. Plants did not come from these. But if we look at charophytes, this guy, and plants, modern land plants, we would see that somewhere back in time they had a common ancestor that gave rise to both of them. You could think of it kind of like chimps and humans. We do not come from chimps, but at some point in history we shared a common ancestor, and the charophytes are thought to be the plant's nearest living algal relative. All right, if plants are thought to be descended from algae, green algae, then what do we base that on? There's a lot of evidence for that connection. They are both multicellular, they are both eukaryotic, they are both photosynthetic autotrophs. Okay, all three of those are of course key. Both groups have cellulose cell walls. Both types of chlorophyll, A and B, are both present. They both store carbohydrates in the form of starch. And so all of those things point to a unification of these groups. What links them specifically, plants specifically, to charophytes are 4 other characteristics. You won't need to remember these, but you should have some sense that DNA analysis does link them very closely, and it's really hard to argue with the DNA, the genetic code that is present. All right. So let's try to imagine what it might have been like in the world of the common ancestor to the plants and the charophytes. Some ancient algae, kind of like maybe the charophytes, inhabited shallow waters at the edges of lakes, ponds, things like that. Because it lived at these border regions of a body of water, it was adapted to survive occasional drying. There was coating on the spores that protected them from drying out. True aquatic algae don't have that, but this group did. Natural selection apparently had favored that. It arose and it was favored so that these organisms could occupy this habitat of this borderline land-water habitat. So natural selection would favor individual algae that could survive periods, albeit brief, out of water. And then this led to adaptive radiation from this common ancestor outwards onto all those habitats available on land. So, why? Why would natural selection favor a move to land once it had started? Because land had some big assets. Wonderful, beautiful, bright sunlight that was unfiltered by water. Remember, water is going to absorb a lot of that sunlight. So if you are an algae, you're losing some of your energy as the water gets absorbed by sunlight, and certainly you can't go down very deep, or you're going to lose all your sunlight altogether. So unfiltered sunlight, abundance of CO2. If you'll recall photosynthesis, the equation is CO2 plus H2O plus energy in the form of light. Okay, leads to sugar plus oxygen. So you got to have that, you got to have that. Land has got tons of both of those things. Additionally, another positive about land is the soil has tons of mineral nutrients, things that algae need but the competition for them in water is very, very strong. The minerals are washed out of the soil into the water. So if you could be at the soil at the source, then you would be an advantage for getting those mineral nutrients that plants need. They can't provide, they can't make them themselves. They have to get them from their environment. And, at least at first, there wasn't anything that was going to predate on you. There weren't any herbivores. They hadn't been invented yet, at least not land ones. So, few herbivores, lots and lots of resources, nobody to eat you, big advantages to move to land. Okay? But there are problems in taking advantage of those land assets. You have to be able to figure out how to do without having your body just bathed continually in water. Okay? That means you have got to be able to prevent your body from drying out. Algae don't have that ability. Natural selection does not favor covering you with protective coatings to prevent dehydration if you're floating around in water all the time. In fact, you have to absorb nutrients through your leaf structures and so on from the water. So they had to come up with a way to prevent drying out. They had to have some way to prevent their gametes from drying out. If you're an algae, the way you reproduce is you squirt your sperm, you squirt your eggs into the water and say, have at it, fellas, see you later. And you hope they meet up, they swim. If you squirt your sperm and eggs on the sidewalk, that's not going to work very well. So you have to find a way to keep your gametes from drying out as well. You have to have fertilization without water. The sperm have got to be able to get to the egg without having to swim there. We have to have other ways to get sperm to egg. Additionally, we have to prevent our embryos from drying out. Algae, when sperm meets egg in the water, the little embryonic protist is floating around and eventually it grows into adult. Development happens all right there in the water. Embryos have very delicate tissues that dry out very easily. If you're going to allow your embryo to develop on land, you have to have a way to protect it. And we see a measure of protection here in the development of seeds, though there were other structures that came well before seeds. So plants have solutions to all those problems, those 4 problems. Algae do not have solutions to those problems, and hence algae remain in the water. Plants solve these problems and live on land. So, to distinguish plants from algae, what we use are those solutions that land-living plants developed, that water-living algae did not develop. Those adaptations to land are what distinguish the 2 groups. So, how did land plants solve these problems? Problem 1 that we will talk about is how do you access those resources that are available on land. In other words, on land, you've got great resources. You've got carbon dioxide in the air, you've got minerals in the soil. But those are 2 really different places. Above ground, you have light, you've got CO2, but you've also got significant, you've got light and CO2. Let's just leave it at that. Below ground, you've got your water and your minerals. How to get those at the same time is a huge problem, because if you're going to absorb water and minerals, you have to have unprotected tissue. But if you're going to be up here exposed to the light and taking in CO2, you're going to be exposed to the air, and you've got to prevent yourself from drying out. Algae don't have to solve this problem. They're continually bathed in water, and they absorb things from that aquatic environment. Plants had to solve this problem. So their solution to this dual place, this how do I say, this kind of 2-tone environment where they have to be able to deal with soil and absorbing water, but air and drying out and all of that, is to have what are called apical meristems. And these are small regions of growth that occur in the tips of the roots and the tips of the shoots. So this is an apical. Apical just means tip in this case, okay? Apical meristem, these are where growth occurs, and they allow the plant to grow in two different directions, up and down, and thus access two really different resources: the soil and its resources, and the air and its resources of light, and so on. So this is what apical meristems allow, is this access to growth in two different directions, access in two different environments. The cells that are produced in these two meristems become tissues that are really, really, really different. The leaves up here, my pen doesn't work when the little animation is on. The leaves are going to be coated with protection so they don't lose water, but the roots down here are going to be naked and allowing absorption of water to occur. So really kinds of different tissues in these two different places. Okay. Now, if you're going to make your plant long so that it can get up high and down low, you're going to have to be able to transport things. You've got to be able to transport water from the bottom to the top. Food that's made at the top has to be transported down to the bottom. How do you do that? Okay. Plants, at least the most sophisticated plants, developed tissue that we call vascular tissue. And if you have ever eaten celery and you pull it and you see those strands of stringy stuff, that's the vascular tissue. It's tubes, it's tubing that allows large amounts of water and food to go up and down in a plant. So tissues that can move, and this is important, large quantities of materials through a plant. Without that, osmosis is the only alternative. And if you're an algae, osmosis is fine. But if you're a plant, that's not going to work as well, because you've got to move large amounts of material long distances. Okay? Osmosis is really a drag. It is slow, and it really does limit the size an organism can attain. If you are relying on osmosis, movement of molecules from one cell to the next cell to the next cell, you can't get very large in that situation. Okay, that's just showing you what a meristem looks like. Remember our mitosis lab where we looked at a root tip? Well, what we were looking at was the meristem, where the growth occurs, and it's lots of mitosis happening there. Okay. Second problem, and I almost feel like we should have addressed this first, is evaporation of water from your body tissues. That is huge. If you're an algae, you're constantly bathed in water. You don't have to worry about that. And also you freely accept nutrients from the water. You don't want your tissues to be protected. You're taking stuff in from the water. But if you take that same algae out of the water and put it on land, it's going to die really quick because it will rapidly lose water. If you've ever seen algae washed up on the sand on the beach, it gets crispy fast because it loses the water out of its tissues. So, land plants, solve this problem by developing protective tissues. Epidermis, which is a single layer of cells. A single layer of cells at the top of a plant, and very importantly, this layer called the cuticle, which is not cells but a layer of wax that actually acts as a water barriers to keep water inside that plant, prevent it from evaporating, so it prevents water loss. Stomata are cells that are guarded by special cells. These holes in the bottom of the leaf can open and close because they're guarded by special cells that can allow gas in. But if we're worried about too much water escaping, we can close these holes up. So they're really, really important. They allow for gas exchange, CO2 in, O2 out. Remember, this is photosynthesis we're talking about. We want to take CO2 in. And we can do that through those holes. Drying out of sex cells and embryos. How in the world do they deal with that? Aquatic organisms don't need to worry about that. Okay? Land organisms have to worry about that big time. So, what they do is, of course, they're going to protect those gametes initially and then the embryos. They protect the gametes, the sex cells, the eggs, inside protective structures called gametangia. There's the word right there. So this is showing you, I believe, the development of a female reproductive cell, again protected in this structure called a gametangia, that would prevent this frail little cell, this egg cell, for example, from drying out. Okay, so they prevent drying of sperm and or egg. But additionally, you've got to get those sperm and egg out into the environment so that they can meet. You have to protect them when they're out trying to meet each other from drying out during their dispersal. So in the more advanced plants, gametes are protected in structures that we might recognize here as pollen grains that can travel through the air, for example. That's flying sperm. The sperm are in these little grains, and they land on the female. The female protects her egg inside of a structure in a flowering plant, for example, and this traveling sperm is protected by its pollen grain and can fertilize that egg. We importantly are not dependent on swimming sperm. That gets plants away from the water very effectively. Okay? But let's say we've gotten sperm and egg together. We've got to protect those embryos too. The tissues of an embryo are very delicate. So in this case, in land plants, again, much like what we see with animals, the solution is to protect the development inside either an egg or the mother. And what we see is that egg fertilization in land plants is going to occur inside the female, inside of her gametangium, where she creates her eggs. The zygote develops into an embryo inside those structures, and they're nourished and retained in there during their development. Eventually, those embryos get dispersed in structures that also help them from drying out. Those structures are things we would call spores, and later on in the most advanced plants we see seeds. But both of these are there to protect embryos. These spores are less sophisticated than seeds, but nonetheless better than just naked sperm and egg flailing around out in a dry environment. Okay? It is important that we understand that not all of those solutions were achieved boom at once. They were achieved stepwise, a little at a time, and the evolutionary record is really, really clear about this. We can see the steps. Plant evolution is neat and tidy in ways that animal evolution sometimes is more confusing. Because of that, we can use these steps that we see in the evolution of these land adaptations as a way to determine a really nice plant family tree, or what we would call a phylogeny. We've had that term before. And here is the plant tree. You can see the family tree in plants is very, very straightforward. There's nothing confusing about this. And so as we go through our different plant groups, you will fully understand this tree. The base of the tree here is showing you a common ancestor. Let's try that color. The common ancestor of plants, and the charophytes would be down here. The charophytes, the algae, are going up there, and then we have our first branch point. So this is the first true plant group, the bryophytes, and we'll talk about them. Okay? And you can see the other common names pop up. We're going to talk about this slide much more, but each little circled point is a place where there was a new adaptation that led to even more success on land. Okay? We'll talk about that. Alright, classification of plants. You need to know that they are in the domain. Remember, a domain is a large level over kingdom. There are 3 domains the eukarya, the archaea, and the eubacteria. Thank you. There are the eubacteria and the archaea are both prokaryotic. So these are both bacterial groups, and then the eukarya are all the eukaryotes, with the plants, the animals, the fungus, all of that in this group, the protists. So plant kingdom. All right. And there are 10 major phyla. Phylum, the level of phylum is actually in plants called division. I don't know why, just to be difficult, I suppose. So if you see the word phylum, or actually, let me rephrase, if talking about plants you see the word division, just think in your mind phylum, same level, okay? And there are 10 major divisions in plants. 3 of these are non-vascular groups of plants. In other words, they don't have that sophisticated plumbing to move stuff up and down their bodies. So these are plants that lack that, so they have to rely on osmosis. And all the other ones are vascular, and it's the vast majority that are vascular plants. 93% of all plants. Very few are around today that are actually non-vascular. The bryophyte group, we are talking about basically mosses and a few others. So the 2 major groups are the non-vascular and the vascular plants. Please get in your head these 2 groups. Non-vascular plants, very small groups. They're ancient, they're primitive, meaning very like the very first plants that would have evolved on Earth. They rely on cell-to-cell diffusion, or what we might refer to as osmosis, and I can't spell anymore, diffusion. Think moss. Okay, they're very small because they can't attain great size because they're relying on diffusion and osmosis. Because they don't have vascular tissue, the plumbing, they don't technically have true roots, stems, or shoots because those are defined by having the vascular tissue. The vascular group is more recent, more advanced, has the vascular tissue. They can get huge. You need to think mighty oak trees, and they of course have true roots, stems, and shoots. There are 3 major groups of the vascular plants, and we're going to talk about those really quickly. However, I think what I might do, let me see where I am. Discard. Where are we? Yeah, I think I will stop here and we'll pick up. So you've got your overall water to land idea and some of the things that had to happen in order for that to occur. And what we're next going to go into is the details of the 4 major, the mosses, the ferns, the seedless vascular plants, and the no, my bad. The naked seed plants, and then the true flowering plants that we're familiar with today. We'll go into the details of their evolution. So we're going to stop there. We'll pick it up in the next podcast. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.